0400 hours. The grass airfield at Orel was still dark, the kind of suffocating blackness that comes before a Russian summer dawn. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a single Ilyushin IL-2 Shturmovik coughed to life, its Mikulin AM-38F engine shattering the silence with a guttural roar that sounded less like an aircraft and more like an industrial foundry coming online. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Inside the cramped cockpit, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Pavlovich Maryenko checked his instruments for the third time. Oil pressure steady, fuel tanks full, 8 RS-82 rockets loaded beneath the wings, and nestled in the bomb bay, 192 PTAB-2, 5 to 1.5 anti-tank bomblets, each one a 5-pound-shaped charge designed for a single purpose: to punch through the top armor of a German Panzer and incinerate everything inside. The date was July 7, 1943. The place was the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Eastern Front, where over 2 million men and 6,000 tanks were about to collide in what would become the largest armored battle in human history. For the past 3 days, German Panzer divisions had been hammering northward through Soviet defensive lines with terrifying efficiency. Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands rolled forward in steel wedges, their frontal armor shrugging off most Soviet anti-tank shells like raindrops. But Maryenko wasn't worried about frontal armor. He was going to hit them from above. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The briefing had been blunt. No theatrics, no propaganda slogans, just raw tactical reality delivered by Major Konstantin Semenovich, commander of the 291st Assault Aviation Division. He'd spread a reconnaissance photograph across the makeshift table, his finger tracing a cluster of dark shapes arrayed in tight formation just south of Ponyri Station. German 9th Panzer Division, he'd said, his voice flat with exhaustion. 83 tanks, mostly Panzer IVs and a few Tigers. They're staging for another push at dawn. Intelligence estimates they'll break through our infantry positions within hours if we don't stop them. Someone had asked the obvious question. What about our own tanks? Semenovich's expression hadn't changed. We lost most of our T-34 seconds yesterday. Artillery's been hammered for 72 hours straight. The only thing between those Panzers and Kursk is us. The room had gone quiet. Everyone understood what that meant. The IL-2 Shturmovik, nicknamed Ilyusha by its crews and the flying tank by Soviet propaganda, was about to become the last line of defense, not metaphorically. Literally, 8 attack aircraft against 83 tanks. The odds were impossible. But impossible had become routine on the Eastern Front by the summer of 1943. Maryenko had learned this the hard way. He'd been flying Shturmoviks since the autumn of 1941, back when the war was still measured in catastrophic Soviet retreats and German armies racing toward Moscow. Back then, the IL-2 had been a death sentence for its crew. Single-seater models with no rear gunner, no protection for the tail section. German Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds would simply position themselves behind an IL-2 and pour cannon fire into the unarmored fuselage until the aircraft disintegrated. In the early months, one Shturmovik was lost for every 10 combat missions, sometimes worse. The 4th Assault Aviation Regiment had started the war with 63 flyable IL-2 seconds. Within weeks, 60 were shot down. The survivors weren't celebrated as heroes. They were simply reassigned to whatever aircraft remained operational and sent back into the meat grinder. But Maryenko had survived. Through skill, luck, or sheer stubborn refusal to die, he'd flown 118 combat sorties and walked away from 3 forced landings. He'd seen pilots incinerated when their fuel tanks exploded. He'd watched friends spiral into the ground, trailing smoke. He'd learned to sleep through artillery barrages and eat while standing because sitting down meant acknowledging how exhausted he really was. Now, strapped into the armoured cockpit of his IL-2 M3, the 2-seater variant with an actual rear gunner, Maryenko felt something close to confidence. Not optimism, exactly. Confidence was too strong a word for the Eastern Front. But the Shturmovik had evolved since those nightmare days of 1941. The aircraft beneath him was a weapon system designed through brutal trial and error, forged in the crucible of total war. The IL-2's defining feature was its armor, not bolted-on plates or external protection, but a load-bearing armored shell that formed the actual structure of the forward fuselage. 700 kilograms of hardened steel wrapped around the cockpit, engine, radiators, and fuel tanks. The pilot sat inside a bathtub of 5mm to 12mm armor plating. The windscreen was 64mm of bulletproof glass. Even the oil cooler had its own armored housing. This wasn't symbolic protection. This was engineering designed to absorb punishment. German 7.9 2mm machine gun fire bounced off harmlessly. Even 20mm cannon shells struggled to penetrate the thickest sections. American test pilot Eddie Rickenbacker, after inspecting an IL-2 inches 1943, had remarked with genuine awe, "We haven't got anything like it." Behind Maryenko, crammed into a tiny compartment barely large enough for a human being, sat his rear gunner, Sergeant Ponyri Volkov. 21 years old, a farmer's son from Smolensk, Volkov operated a single Berezin UBT 12.7mm machine gun on a flexible mount. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than nothing. Since the introduction of two-seater IL-2 seconds in late 1942, losses to German fighters had dropped measurably. Not eliminated, just reduced from catastrophic to merely terrible. Volkov's life expectancy was still abysmal. Rear gunners in Shturmoviks had one of the highest casualty rates in the Soviet Air Force. The wooden rear fuselage offered minimal protection. If a Bf-109 latched onto their tail, Volkov's 12.7 was the only thing standing between survival and oblivion. He knew this. Everyone knew this. It was simply accepted as the cost of flying. The engine note changed as Maryenko advanced the throttle. Around him, 7 other IL-2 seconds were starting their own engines, the combined roar building into a physical force that vibrated through the ground. 8 aircraft. 16 men. 154 PTAB bomblets per plane, plus rockets and cannon shells, against 83 German tanks. Major Semenovich had been clear about the tactic. They would use the circle of death, a formation developed through desperate improvisation during the Battle of Stalingrad. The IL-2 seconds would form a defensive ring over the target area, flying in a continuous circuit. One aircraft at a time would peel off, dive toward the enemy tanks, release its bomblets, and rejoin the circle. While one attacked, the others would cover it with their forward-firing machine guns and cannons, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it suicidal for German fighters to close in. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. The circle of death required absolute discipline. Break formation, and you died. Hesitate, and you died. Fly predictably, and you died. But executed correctly, it turned 8 vulnerable ground attack aircraft into a rotating buzzsaw of continuous firepower. Maryenko released the brakes and began taxiing toward the grass strip. The IL-2 was not graceful on the ground. It was heavy, nose-heavy, and the tailwheel configuration made forward visibility nearly non-existent. But once airborne, the Shturmovik transformed, not into a fighter exactly. It would never dogfight or outmaneuver anything, but it became purposeful, relentless, a machine built for one mission, to destroy tanks. The grass runway stretched ahead, a pale strip cut through dark fields. Maryenko aligned with the centerline, checked his gauges one final time, and pushed the throttle to full military power. The AM-38F engine, producing 1,700 horsepower at takeoff, dragged the aircraft forward with violent acceleration. The tail came up. Airspeed climbed through 50 knots, 70, 90. At 120 kilometers per hour, Maryenko pulled back gently on the stick, and the IL-2 unstuck from the earth, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness. One by one, the other 7 aircraft followed. No radio chatter, no unnecessary communication. just 8 silhouettes rising into the grey light, forming into a loose echelon as they turned south toward Ponyri Station. Toward 83 German tanks, toward a mission that Soviet historians would later describe with clinical detachment, assault aviation conducted multiple strikes against enemy armored formations, resulting in significant material losses. But that summary, typed months later in some Moscow office, would never capture what was about to happen. The noise, the fear, the mathematical brutality of shaped charges meeting armor plate at terminal velocity. The moment when desperate tactics collided with industrial warfare and produced something that looked, from a distance, almost like a miracle. The horizon ahead was just beginning to lighten. Somewhere beyond those trees, German Panzer crews were performing their own morning rituals, checking fuel, loading ammunition, warming engines. They had no idea that 154 armor-piercing bomblets were about to rain down from Soviet aircraft that shouldn't have been able to reach them, using weapons that shouldn't have existed, flown by pilots who statistically shouldn't have survived this long. Maryenko checked his watch. 04:32, target in 15 minutes. He reached forward and armed the bomb release mechanism. The Battle of Kursk, July 7, 1943, had just entered its most crucial phase, and for the German 9th Panzer Division, the next 20 minutes would be the longest of the war, 04:45 hours. The IL-2 formation crossed the forward line at an altitude of 800 meters, the ground below still shrouded in morning mist. Through breaks in the fog, Maryenko could see the scars of 3 days of fighting, burned-out T-34 seconds littering the fields, artillery craters overlapping like lunar landscapes, the skeletal remains of a village that no longer had a name, just coordinates on a map. The Eastern Front had transformed the concept of warfare itself. This wasn't the lightning campaigns of 1941, when German Panzers had raced across open steppe with almost casual efficiency. This was attrition warfare at industrial scale, both sides feeding men and machines into a furnace, measuring progress in meters rather than kilometers, calculating victory not by territory gained but by how many enemy tanks burned before your own did. Kursk was different, though. Kursk was deliberate. The Germans had massed nearly 3,000 tanks for Operation Citadel, their summer offensive designed to pinch off the Soviet salient and restore momentum to a war that had been grinding sideways since Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein commanded the southern pincer. General Walther Model drove the northern thrust. Between them, the finest armoured divisions in the Wehrmacht, equipped with new Tigers and Panthers that Soviet intelligence reports described with barely concealed alarm, the Tigers especially. Panzerkampfwagen 6, mounting an 88mm gun that could kill a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. Frontal armour, 100mm thick, sloped and hardened. Soviet tank crews had learned to fear the distinctive silhouette. Stories circulated through the ranks. A single Tiger holding off an entire Soviet tank battalion. Multiple hits from 76mm guns bouncing off harmlessly. German crews operating with the arrogance of invincibility. But invincibility had limits, and one of those limits was physics. No matter how thick your frontal armour, the top of a tank was always vulnerable. It had to be. Turrets needed to traverse. Hatches needed to open. Engine compartments required ventilation. The top armour on a Panzer IV was only 20mm thick. On a Tiger, 30mm, barely enough to stop small arms fire. The PTAB bomblet was designed to exploit this weakness with surgical precision. 5.5 pounds of shaped charge, aerodynamically stable, equipped with a nose fuse that detonated on contact. The explosion would form a superheated jet of molten metal, travelling at 8,000 meters per second, punching through armor plate and spraying the interior with fragments and fire. Ammunition would cook off. Fuel would ignite. Crew members would have perhaps 3 seconds to escape before the entire tank became an oven. One PTAB couldn't carpet an area, but 192 PTABs, dropped from an IL-2 at 300 meters altitude, would saturate a kill zone 70 meters long and 15 meters wide. An entire Panzer platoon could be bracketed in a single pass. The Germans called it Eisenhagel, iron hail. The weapon had been ready since April 1943, but Stalin himself had forbidden its use, holding the PTABs in reserve for a decisive moment. Kursk was that moment. Nearly 1 million bomblets had been distributed to assault aviation units with strict orders. Maximum surprise, maximum effect. The Germans couldn't be allowed to develop countermeasures. Maryenko descended to 500 meters as they approached the target area. Below, the morning mist was beginning to burn off under the rising sun, revealing the landscape in harsh detail. He could see the railway line running north from Ponyri Station, the zigzag pattern of trench systems. And there, arrayed in 3 distinct groups, just south of the tree line, the dark shapes of German armor. "I see them." Volkov's voice crackled through the interphone. "Murder. That's a lot of tanks." Panzers parked in tight formation, probably assembled for a coordinated attack. Fuel trucks positioned nearby. Half-track supply vehicles clustered around what looked like a command post. The Germans had staging areas like this all along the Kursk salient, forward assembly points, where armoured units could regroup, refuel, and prepare for the next push. They were also perfect targets for ground attack aircraft. Concentrated, stationary, vulnerable. The only question was whether 8 IL-2 seconds could reach them before German anti-aircraft guns and fighters responded. Major Semenovich's voice came through the radio, calm and methodical. Attack formation. Circle at 400 meters. First pass in 60 seconds. Engage on my mark. The 8 Shturmoviks began their turn, forming the defensive circle that had become their signature tactic. Each aircraft positioned itself to cover the one ahead, creating overlapping fields of fire. The formation looked almost lazy from a distance, a gentle carousel in the sky. But the geometry was precise, calculated to give rear gunners clear shots at any fighter, trying to penetrate the circle, while allowing individual aircraft to peel off for attack runs without breaking the defensive screen. Below, German soldiers were beginning to notice. Maryenko could see figures running between vehicles, anti-aircraft crews scrambling to their positions. Someone fired a recognition flare, green, probably querying whether the approaching aircraft were friendly. The answer came 30 seconds later, when the first IL-2 rolled out of the circle and dove toward the tank concentration. Major Semenovich's aircraft. Nose down at 30 degrees, airspeed building through 350 kilometers per hour. The IL-2's 2 V-wire 23mm cannons opened fire first, tracers walking across the ground, suppressing anti-aircraft positions. Then, at 300 meters altitude, the PTAB bomblets released. From Maryenko's position in the circle, it looked almost gentle, a dark cloud dispersing beneath Semenovich's aircraft, individual bomblets tumbling through the air, stabilizing, beginning their terminal descent. Then, the first impacts. The kill zone erupted, 192 shaped charges detonating within 3 seconds, each explosion a bright orange flash followed by a pillar of black smoke. The noise was physical, a continuous rolling thunder that overwhelmed individual detonations. Maryenko saw a Panzer IV's turret blown completely off the hull, flipping end over end before crashing down 50 meters away. Another tank simply exploded from within, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that lifted the entire vehicle off the ground. Secondary explosions began immediately, fuel trucks detonating, ammunition crates. The cascade effect of one explosion triggering the next, creating a firestorm that spread across the staging area like a living thing. Second aircraft, attack, Semenovich's voice, still calm, somehow audible over the chaos. The second IL-2 rolled out and dove. More PTABs, more explosions. A third cluster of tanks erupted in flames. German anti-aircraft guns were firing now, streams of tracer rounds arcing upward, but the gunners were aiming at where the IL-2 seconds had been, not where they were going. The circle of death was working exactly as designed, each aircraft attacking from a different angle, making it impossible for the defenders to concentrate their fire. Maryenko's turn. He pushed the stick forward, felt the familiar sensation of negative G as the nose dropped. The target area expanded in his windscreen. Burning tanks, figures running, a half-track trying to reverse away from the inferno. He centered the aiming reticle, adjusted for wind drift, and reached for the bomb release. At 300 meters, he toggled the switch. The aircraft lurched slightly as the PTAB dispensers opened, 192 bomblets tumbling free. He held the dive for 2 more seconds, firing both cannons, the recoil shaking the airframe, then pulled back hard on the stick. 4 Gs, 6 Gs, the horizon spun. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. Then he was climbing, banking right to rejoin the circle, and behind him the third wave of PTABs was impacting. He'd barely leveled off when Volkov screamed, "Fokker, Wolf! 7 o'clock high!" Maryenko didn't think. He kicked left rudder, rolled the IL-2 into a banking turn steep enough to blacken his peripheral vision. The Fokker Wolf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's most lethal fighters, flashed past where they'd been 3 seconds earlier, its cannon fire tearing empty air. Volkov's 12.7 opened up, long chattering burst, tracers chasing the German fighter as it pulled up and away. "Did you hit him?" "I don't know. He's coming around." But the FW-190 pilot had made a mistake. He'd fixated on one target and broken through the circle of death without support. Now he was inside the formation, surrounded by 7 IL-2 seconds whose rear gunners all had clear shots. Multiple 12.7mm streams converged on the German fighter. Maryenko saw impacts stitching across the fuselage, the engine cowling, the canopy. The FW-190 shuddered, rolled inverted, and fell away trailing white coolant vapor. No parachute. The pilot either dead or unconscious before he could bail out. Maryenko felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just tactical awareness. One less threat. Keep flying. The attack continued. 4th, IL-2. 5th, 6th. Each pass adding another 192 bomblets to the inferno below. The staging area was no longer recognizable as a military position. It was just fire and smoke and the twisted wreckage of what had been, minutes earlier, a functional armored formation. Maryenko's fuel gauge showed 60% remaining. Ammunition count for the cannons showed 200 rounds expended, 300 remaining. The PTABs were gone, dispensers empty, but each IL-2 still carried 8 RS-82 rockets beneath the wings. Not particularly accurate, but devastatingly effective against soft targets. Fuel trucks, supply vehicles, anything that wasn't armored. All aircraft, second pass, Seminovich ordered. Rockets and cannon, sanitize the area. The circle of death reformed, lower now, at 300 meters. The anti-aircraft fire had intensified. German gunners recovering from their initial shock, but half their positions had been destroyed in the first wave. The remaining guns were firing frantically, desperately, streams of tracer, creating a web of fire that the IL-2 seconds simply flew through. Armor worked. The bathtub worked. Rounds that would have shredded any other aircraft pinged off the Shturmovik's steel shell. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maryenko's second dive was shallower, faster. He pickled off all 8 rockets in a ripple salvo, the RS-82 seconds streaking downward on pillars of white smoke. 6 impacted near a fuel truck convoy. The remaining 2 hit nothing but dirt. Then his cannons, long sustained burst, walking fire across what remained of the staging area. He pulled up at 200 meters, so low he could feel the heat from the burning tanks, and climbed back into the circle. The entire engagement had lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes from first bomb release to final rocket impact, when the 8th IL-2 completed its second pass and rejoined the formation. Major Seminovich gave the order to return to base. They flew north in loose formation, no longer maintaining the defensive circle, just 8 exhausted crews trying to process what they'd just accomplished. Behind them, a column of black smoke rose 3,000 meters into the morning sky, visible for dozens of kilometers. Below, the German 9th Panzer Division's staging area was a burning graveyard. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft would photograph the site later that morning. Intelligence analysts would count the wrecks. 34 tanks confirmed destroyed. Another 16 damaged beyond field repair. Multiple fuel trucks, supply vehicles, and ammunition carriers obliterated. Over 100 casualties among German tank crews and support personnel. The Soviet staff report filed that afternoon would read with bureaucratic understatement. Assault aircraft delivered 3 powerful attacks in groups of 20 to 30, which resulted in the destruction and disabling of 34 tanks. The enemy was forced to halt further attacks and to withdraw the remnants of his force north of Kashara. The numbers in that report were carefully calibrated. The claim of 20 to 30 aircraft per group was exaggerated, inflating 8 IL-2 seconds into a larger formation for propaganda purposes. The 34 tanks destroyed was conservative, probably accurate, but the report didn't mention the real significance of the attack, didn't mention that the German 9th Panzer Division, which had started July 7th with 83 operational tanks, had just lost 40% of its armor in 11 minutes. Didn't mention that Operation Citadel, the massive German summer offensive, was grinding to a halt not because of superior Soviet tanks or better tactics, but because the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air superiority over the battlefield. The IL-2 Shturmovik, that ugly, brutish, supposedly obsolete ground attack aircraft, had become the decisive weapon of the Eastern Front. Maryenko landed at 05:23 hours, his IL-2 showing 12 holes from anti-aircraft fire, none critical, all absorbed by the armor. Volkov climbed out of the rear compartment, looking pale and shaky, but alive. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, beginning immediate rearming and refueling. Another mission was already being planned for midday. How many? Someone asked. Maryenko just looked at the smoke column still visible on the southern horizon. Enough, he said. But enough was never really enough, not in 1943. The Battle of Kursk would continue for another month. The IL-2 squadrons would fly hundreds more sorties. More pilots would die, more tanks would burn. The arithmetic of attrition would continue its remorseless calculation. Yet something had shifted that morning. Some invisible threshold had been crossed. The Germans had entered the Kursk salient, believing their new Tigers and Panthers made them invincible. They were learning, at terrible cost, that invincibility was an illusion. That 5-pound bomblets could defeat 100-ton monsters. That 8 aircraft could cripple a panzer division. The psychological impact would prove almost as important as the material losses. German tank crews who survived the PTAB attacks described the experience with something close to trauma. The sound of aircraft engines overhead now triggered immediate panic. Units that had once advanced with confidence began seeking cover at the first hint of Soviet aircraft. The Panzer arm, backbone of the Wehrmacht, was developing what pilots would recognize as combat fatigue. Meanwhile, Soviet assault aviation was gaining confidence with every mission. The IL-2, once a death trap, had evolved into a weapon system that worked. Not perfectly. Losses remained heavy, but survivable, repeatable, scalable. By the end of July 1943, over 30,000 Shturmoviks would be in service, and Soviet factories were producing more every week. Maryenko flew 4 more combat missions that day. He would fly another 92 before the war ended. He would survive 2 forced landings, 3 direct hits from anti-aircraft fire, and 1 mid-air collision with a German fighter that somehow left his IL-2 still airborne. He would eventually be awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union and promoted to captain. But he would never forget July 7, 1943, the morning when 8 aircraft destroyed enough German armor to change the mathematics of an entire battle, the morning when the flying tank proved that sometimes audacity and shaped charges mattered more than thick armor and 88mm guns, the morning when the impossible became just another mission. The summer sun climbed higher over the Kursk salient as Maryenko's squadron landed and began the mechanical ballet of rearmament. Ground crews worked with practiced urgency, hauling ammunition belts, rolling fresh PTAB dispensers into position, topping off fuel tanks from aging trucks that leaked gasoline into the trampled grass. The IL-2 seconds, scorched and bullet-scarred, waited like patient workhorses for their next turn in the slaughter. By 0700 hours, reconnaissance reports were filtering through Soviet command channels. The initial assessment of the morning's attack was being revised upward. Not 34 tanks destroyed, 42, with another 20 damaged severely enough to require depot-level repair. The German 9th Panzer Division wasn't just disrupted, it was combat ineffective for the immediate future. Major General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front, read the intelligence summary with the careful skepticism of a man who'd seen too many inflated combat reports. But the reconnaissance photographs were undeniable. Entire sections of the staging area looked like a scrapyard, tanks overturned or blown apart, some burned down to their chassis. He initialed the report and passed it to his air operations officer with a single annotation: "Repeat as necessary." That phrase, "repeat as necessary," would define Soviet assault aviation tactics for the remainder of the war. The IL-2 Shturmovik was no longer an experiment or a desperate improvisation. It was doctrine, a proven weapon system that could be deployed systematically, repeatedly, at scale. But doctrine was written in Moscow by officers who never smelled burning diesel and cooked flesh. For the men flying the missions, doctrine was just paperwork. Reality was climbing back into a cockpit still warm from the last sortie, knowing the Germans would be waiting with more flak, more fighters, more ways to kill you. Maryenko's second mission launched at 1100 hours, 12 IL-2 seconds this time, targeting a different German armor concentration near Olkhovatka. The tactics were identical: circle of death, PTAB bombardment, rockets and cannon on the second pass. But this time the Germans were ready. Anti-aircraft batteries had been repositioned overnight, quadruple 20mm flak-veerling mounts that could put out 1,800 rounds per minute, creating a curtain of fire that even IL-2 armor couldn't completely defeat. 2 Shturmoviks went down on the first pass. One disintegrated when a shell hit its ammunition bay. The other took a 20mm round through the engine, coolant spraying, and managed to glide 3 kilometers before pancaking into a wheat field. The pilot survived. The rear gunner didn't. Maryenko pressed his attack anyway. That was the IL-2 doctrine distilled to its essence. Press the attack anyway. Accept the losses. Complete the mission. The mathematics were brutal but unavoidable. If you lost 2 aircraft, but destroyed 20 tanks, you won. The Soviet Union could replace aircraft faster than Germany could replace tanks. That was the grim arithmetic of the Eastern Front by 1943. His PTABs bracketed a cluster of Panzer IVs attempting to disperse. He saw at least 3 direct hits, maybe 4, tanks erupting in the characteristic orange flash of penetrated ammunition. Secondary explosions rippled across the formation. A Tiger tried to reverse away from the kill zone and threw a track, immobilizing itself. Another perfect target for the second wave. By the time they returned to base, Maryenko's IL-2 had taken 37 hits. Most bounced off the armor. 5 punched through the wooden rear fuselage. 1 had grazed Volkov's left leg, not deep, but bleeding enough to require medical attention. The rear gunner refused evacuation, wrapping the wound himself with torn undershirt and climbing back into his position for the afternoon mission. "I'm not giving some replacement my seat," Volkov muttered. "New gunners don't last a week." It was true. Rear gunners in IL-2 seconds had the highest attrition rate of any position in Soviet aviation. They sat in an unarmored compartment, exposed to every fighter attack from behind, armed with a single machine gun that jammed frequently and offered minimal protection. Many squadrons cycled through gunners every few missions, fresh conscripts or volunteers who didn't fully understand what they were signing up for until the first Messerschmitt latched onto their tail. Volkov had survived 28 sorties. That made him a veteran. Maryenko trusted him. Trust was currency in assault aviation, more valuable than rank or decorations. You trusted your gunner to keep fighters off your tail. You trusted your wingman to cover you during attack runs. You trusted your ground crew to load your weapons correctly and check your fuel lines for leaks. Break that trust, and people died. The third mission of July 7th launched at 15:00 hours, 8 IL-2 seconds against a German supply column near Ponyri. This one went faster. The column was strung out along a road, trucks and half-tracks in single file, perfect for strafing runs. Maryenko expended his entire ammunition load in 4 passes. Cannon fire walking the length of the convoy, PTABs cratering the road itself. By the time they broke off, the entire column was burning, blocking the route for follow-on reinforcements. Back at base, Maryenko climbed out of his cockpit and sat on the wing root, too exhausted to walk. A medic appeared, thrust a tin cup of water into his hands. He drank without tasting. Someone said the 4th sortie was delayed until dusk. Someone else said intelligence estimated they'd destroyed over 100 German vehicles today. Numbers. Always numbers. As if the war could be won by arithmetic. But maybe it could. That was the terrible revelation of Kursk. The Soviet Union had learned to fight industrial warfare on industrial terms. Outproduce the enemy. Overwhelm them with quantity. Accept horrific losses as the cost of eventual victory. The IL-2 embodied that philosophy perfectly, not elegant, not sophisticated, just numerous, durable, and lethal enough to matter. By the end of July 7, 1943, Soviet assault aviation had flown over 400 sorties against German armor in the Kursk salient. Official reports claimed over 200 tanks destroyed. The actual figure was probably lower, perhaps 150 confirmed kills. Still extraordinary, still enough to blunt the German offensive and force Wehrmacht commanders to recalculate their entire strategy. Operation Citadel, which had begun with such confidence just days earlier, was failing. Not because of heroic Soviet tank counterattacks or brilliant defensive maneuvering, it was failing because German Panzer divisions couldn't concentrate their forces without being swarmed by IL-2 seconds dropping PTABs. The simple physics of shaped charges versus top armor was unbeatable. No amount of German tactical skill could overcome that fundamental vulnerability. Field Marshal von Manstein would later write in his memoirs that Kursk marked the moment when the Luftwaffe lost air superiority over the Eastern Front. Not completely, not immediately. But the trend was irreversible. Soviet aviation, once dismissed as primitive and ineffective, had achieved rough parity in numbers and was developing tactics that exploited German weaknesses. The IL-2 inches particular had evolved from a liability into the single most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. German soldiers began using a new phrase that summer, Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. When IL-2 seconds appeared overhead, entire units would abandon their positions and scatter, knowing that concentrated formations meant death. Panzer crews painted extra camouflage on the tops of their tanks, trying desperately to avoid detection from above. Anti-aircraft battalions were pulled from other fronts and rushed to Kursk, but there were never enough guns to cover every vulnerable formation. The psychological damage was incalculable. German soldiers who'd spent 2 years believing in their own invincibility were learning fear. Soviet pilots, who'd spent 2 years dying in obsolete aircraft, were learning confidence. The balance was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Maryenko flew his 4th and final sortie of July 7th at 2100 hours, just before sunset. A small mission, only 4 IL-2 seconds, targeting German artillery positions identified by forward observers. The attack went smoothly. No losses. They returned to base in near darkness, landing by the light of kerosene lanterns positioned along the grass strip. Total flight time for the day, 6 hours 40 minutes. Total combat missions, 4. Ammunition expended, 1,000 rounds of 23mm cannon shells, 8 RS-82 rockets, and 192 PTAB bomblets. Confirmed tank kills. Personal score, 9. Squadron total for the day, 37 German tanks destroyed, 58 other vehicles destroyed or damaged, estimated 300 casualties inflicted on enemy personnel. Cost: 2 IL-2 seconds shot down, 3 pilots killed, 1 rear gunner killed, 4 aircraft damaged requiring depot repair, 12 men wounded, 5 seriously. The mathematics of attrition. The arithmetic of industrial warfare. The cold calculus that said trading 2 aircraft for 37 tanks was a victory, even if you knew the names of the men who didn't come back. Maryenko sat in the operations tent that night, writing his after-action report by lantern light. The standard form asked for dry tactical details: time of attack, altitude, weapons employed, results observed. It didn't ask how it felt to watch a Panzer crew burn alive inside their tank. Didn't ask whether you could still taste the smoke hours later. Didn't ask whether you'd remember the faces of your squadron mates who'd been flying beside you that morning and were now listed as missing, presumed dead. He filled in the blanks with professional detachment and signed his name at the bottom. The report would be filed, summarized, and eventually incorporated into some larger statistical analysis that would inform future tactical decisions. That was how modern war worked. Individual experiences aggregated into data. Data analyzed for patterns. Patterns codified into doctrine. Doctrine implemented by the next generation of pilots who would have their own reports to file, their own dead to mourn. The Battle of Kursk continued for another month. The largest tank battle in history would ultimately involve over 6,000 armored vehicles, 2 million men, and result in nearly 200,000 casualties on each side. The Germans would fail to break through Soviet defenses. They would transition to a fighting retreat that would continue, with few interruptions, all the way to Berlin. Soviet assault aviation would fly, tens of thousands more sorties. IL-2 Shturmoviks would destroy thousands more tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces. Losses would remain heavy. By war's end, over 11,000 IL-2 seconds would be shot down, representing 30% of all Soviet aviation losses. That's over 11,000 aircraft, roughly 22,000 crew members killed or missing. But over 36,000 IL-2 seconds were built during the war, making it the most produced combat aircraft in history. For every Shturmovik shot down, 3 more rolled off Soviet assembly lines. For every pilot killed, 2 more completed training. The industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, combined with the tactical effectiveness of the IL-2, created an unstoppable momentum that Germany simply could not match. Maryenko survived the war. He flew 210 combat missions total, was shot down 4 times, wounded twice, and awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union in December 1944. After the war, he became a flight instructor, training the next generation of Soviet pilots. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, deflecting questions with vague generalities about duty and service. But in 1978, a military historian tracked him down for an interview. The historian wanted stories about the IL-2, about the famous raids, about the heroic moments that made good material for books and documentaries. Maryenko disappointed him. He didn't remember heroism. He remembered exhaustion, fear, the mechanical process of flying mission after mission because that was simply what you did. When pressed about July 7, 1943, the day his squadron destroyed 42 German tanks in a single morning, Maryenko paused for a long time before answering. "People want to know if we felt like heroes," he said finally. "We didn't. We felt like survivors. Every time you landed and the ground crew started counting holes in your aircraft, you felt like you'd stolen another few hours of life from a war that wanted you dead. The Germans had better tanks, better tactics, better training. We just had more airplanes and less choice about whether to use them." "So what made the difference?" the historian asked. Why did the IL-2 succeed where other aircraft failed? Maryenko thought about that. Armor, he said. The bathtub saved us. You could fly through flak that would shred any other aircraft and still bring your plane home. That gave us confidence. And confidence meant we could press attacks that should have been suicide. The Germans kept expecting us to break off, to run when things got dangerous. We didn't. We couldn't. There was nowhere to run to, so we just kept coming. He paused, staring out the window at the peaceful Moscow afternoon. That morning at Kursk, when we hit that Panzer staging area, I remember thinking this is impossible. 8 aircraft against 80 tanks. We should all die. But we didn't. We dropped our bombs, shot up their columns, and flew home. And that changed something. Not just tactically, psychologically. It proved that German armor could be beaten, that their Tigers weren't invincible, that 5-pound bomblets and armor plate and stubborn determination could overcome technology and training. And the cost? The historian asked quietly. Maryenko's expression darkened. 2 of my squadron mates died that day on the second mission, 3 more the next week. By the end of Kursk, half the pilots I'd started with were gone. Replacements came in, flew a few missions, died or got shot down. It was a rotating door. The aircraft survived longer than the men flying them. He fell silent for a moment, then added, "But we won. That has to mean something. We paid for it. God knows we paid. But we won." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of July 7th, 1943, extends far beyond the immediate tactical results. The IL-2's success at Kursk validated the entire concept of armored ground attack aviation and influenced aircraft design for decades. The American A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, was explicitly designed with lessons learned from the Shturmovik: armor protection for the pilot, redundant flight systems, massive cannon armament, and a design philosophy that prioritized survivability and ground attack capability over speed and maneuverability. Even today, military analysts study the IL-2's combat record. Not because the aircraft itself was particularly advanced, but because it represented a philosophy that rugged, survivable platforms flown by adequately trained pilots in sufficient numbers could overcome technologically superior opponents. It was the victory of mass production and industrial capacity over individual excellence and tactical sophistication. The men who flew those missions, like Maryenko, have largely passed into history now. The last Soviet veterans of Kursk died in the early 2000s. Their stories survive in archives, in official reports written with bureaucratic detachment, in occasional memoirs that hint at experiences too complex and traumatic to fully articulate. But the physical evidence remains. In museums across Russia and Eastern Europe, restored IL-2 Shturmoviks sit behind velvet ropes, their armor plating still bearing the scars of German machine gun fire. At Kursk itself, local farmers still occasionally unearth fragments of destroyed tanks, pieces of aircraft, unexploded ordnance buried in fields that have been peaceful for 8 decades. And in the summer, when the wheat grows tall and the sun hangs low over the same ridges where Panzer divisions once massed, you can sometimes hear older residents tell stories passed down from their grandparents, stories about the morning the sky turned black with Soviet aircraft, about the sound of shaped charges detonating, about columns of smoke visible for dozens of kilometers, about the day the tide turned when impossible odds yielded to armor plate and determination. The Germans had called it Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. Soviet pilots called it Ilyusha, a term of endearment, almost affection. Both names captured truth. The IL-2 Shturmovik was death incarnate for those on the receiving end. For those who flew it, it was a lifeline, an armored shell that bought a few extra seconds of survival in a war where seconds mattered. On July 7, 1943, 8 aircraft changed the calculus of the largest tank battle in history. Not through heroism, though there was plenty of that. Not through technological superiority, because they lacked it. but through the simple, brutal application of shaped charges against armor plate, repeated with industrial efficiency until the mathematics shifted in their favor. That's not the story anyone wanted to tell, not the propagandists in Moscow who preferred tales of heroic sacrifice, not the German commanders who needed to explain their failures, not even the pilots themselves, who understood that survival was mostly luck, and that luck always ran out eventually. But it's the truth. And sometimes, in war, truth is measured in burned tanks and empty cockpits, and 5-pound bomblets that punched through steel as if it were paper. The morning of July 7th, 1943, proved that sometimes audacity and physics matter more than technology and training. That armor plate can substitute for skill when skill isn't enough. That impossible missions become possible when the alternative is defeat. 8 aircraft, 83 tanks, 20 minutes. The arithmetic was impossible, but they did it anyway, and that, more than any medal or propaganda poster or official history, is what makes the story worth remembering. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.